Hi, this is a video that I'm making regarding trying to repair the bottom of a mailbox that's been crumbling. The very bottom is sort of a facade of hard and rough aluminum, and it appears to be crumbling because of tree roots which are growing right next to it. There's an oak tree, and there's a concrete block that's actually holding the mailbox up, and there's a center post in the mailbox connecting down to the concrete block, but it appears that tree roots are causing damage to the facade, which is aluminum on the edges. And so I'm going to be using Bondo to repair all of this. You can see the extensive damage here. There are several broken pieces that are chipped and completely separated from the aluminum facade on the sides. And even like large holes in the bottom of the aluminum facade, you're showing the metal post on the inside of this. This is the Bondo all-purpose putty that I used. This particular putty is good for drywall, metal, masonry, painted wood, and plastic. And it worked pretty well on this rough aluminum. This is sort of an unusual job because the aluminum was vertical, so it was pretty hard to apply in the first place. And of course, as broken up as it was kind of a tough job. But this was the type of Bondo that I used for this. And of course, to support this job, I had to buy a variety of other things. One was this set of gloves, this set of Bondo spreaders, this plastic paint liner that I used to mix the hardener with the putty instead of the plastic cap that came with the Bondo, a couple of packages of 80 and 180 sandpaper, which I didn't happen to use, a little bit more of that in a minute, but I didn't use it because the Bondo became so hard so quickly there was no way the sandpaper was going to be very useful. Always wear eye protection. That's always a good idea for a job like this. If you are successful in doing any sanding, this is probably a good idea as well for even indoor or outdoor use, these filter masks. This can of Rust-Oleum satin paint and primer, which I used for the final painting job. This was actually recommended by one of the people there at Lowe's because it has both a primer and paint within it, and they also didn't recommend a sealer that should be used at the end based on pictures that I gave them of this job that I was trying to do. So based on their recommendation, this is what I used, and so far it's worked out pretty well. I'll show you later on in this video. When you open up the can of putty, it looks like this. It's sort of a grayish white material, and it's about as thick as it can be to the point where you can stir it, but just not barely. I also recommend that you use probably a plastic putty knife instead of like the one I had here, as well as the plastic paint liner and all that to mix it up, mainly because then at least you don't have hardly anything to clean up at the end of the job. Uh, the putty on the back can says they recommend using acetone or paint thinner to clean up, which is just more caustic chemicals. So it's probably easier just to use things that you can throw away, like a plastic putty knife and a plastic liner to mix the whole thing up into so that you don't need to clean up anything at the end. Okay, so what you do is you scoop out about a 3-inch amount of putty and about a 1/2 inch thick onto the tray, and you use the cream hardener, which is included, of course, with the putty. And you knead the tube of hardener a little bit and then put about a 3-inch strip of it on top of the putty, and then use your plastic putty knife to stir it up. Now they recommend that you stir it for about 2 minutes with instructions on the back of the can, but I wouldn't stir it up that long if you put the hardener in. Typically I stirred it for maybe 20 or 30 seconds because if you stir it any longer, at least in my experience, it just gets too stiff to use very well, and it's hard to continue to stir. But typically, when they recommend using this putty, it's for a different type of application than what I have here. Of course, you typically would make it much thinner and spread it out with a putty knife and use it in very small applications. But for this particular thing that I'm trying to do, this is a little bit different than usual. At this point, I used the putty knife and applied the putty on the bottom of the aluminum. I tried to keep the pieces of broken off aluminum attached to it almost like a jigsaw puzzle and applied the putty. This fiberglass cloth came in pretty handy too. You can cut small squares of this and then put it over the bottom holes of the facade that I was trying to patch up, and then just put putty right over the fiberglass cloth, and this worked out real well. As I said before, this stuff sets up so quickly that it obviously should be applied thinner for other applications, and make sure you use either a metal file or something like that within probably a minute or two of actually applying it if you want to make any good progress as far as filing or sanding down this material. When I said earlier in the video I didn't use the sandpaper, I meant specifically for not trying to sandpaper down the putty. What I did do is I used a sanding block with 80 grit sandpaper and sanded down the paint on the rough aluminum here to make it nice and smooth prior to painting. The last phase of all this was to use the spray paint and spray the bottom facade of the post. And I also sanded down the scroll work underneath the mailbox and used a spray paint on that as well. There were also a few other spots on the mailbox that were flaked a little bit, so I used a spray paint on that and sort of gave it an even look overall. As I've stated before, always be safe when you use Bondo. Wear gloves, as I've stated it in this video, because Bondo can be very caustic to the skin and difficult to remove. Wear eye protection, and wear a filter mask when filing or sanding Bondo. Well, that's about it for this video. I thought I'd make it to let you know that there are some unusual applications for this particular kind of putty. So you may want to use it for mailbox repair or anything else you have around the house. So I hope this video was useful, and have a good day.